Well, hello, Imhotep, and welcome. I'm Mog Morgan, and this is the Egyptian Magic Podcast. Okay, back after a little break with a new season, some of which will hopefully be broadcast actually from Egypt itself, if all goes to plan. Certainly do some recording there as we're planning to go on a research trip in the next few weeks. The subject to start off this time, I thought I'd take some time over a few broadcasts to explore the issue of the connection between Egyptian magic and a type of Hindu esotericism known as Tantrism, body magic, just Hinduism if you like. The kind of surprising connection between the two, which is something of a specialism of mine. I originally started my research student career as someone who was, well, I did a degree first of all in philosophy. I should say that it's sort of connected because I've been interested in magic and the occult and mysticism from quite an early time, and I got to reading Blavatsky's book, I think it's The Secret Doctrine, which is this great tome, and plus some other things that were very kind of similar to it, like Morning of the Magicians. And I read this thing, and I don't know, I didn't feel adequate really to make a judgment about some of the things they were saying. They seemed so surprising, I suppose. So one way or another, I thought I needed not just to study magic, but I needed to go on a journey and kind of upgrade my knowledge in other ways, which meant going to university, not going back to university. I hadn't thought about going to it at that stage. So it kind of set me on a journey. And some of the things I'm going to talk about will kind of come full circle to some of the issues that Blavatsky does talk about in the Secret Doctrine, some of which are credible and some of which don't quite work out. Or there was a dream, if you like. There was a dream in theosophy, or a quest within early theosophy, this kind of Victorian esoteric creation, that they could somehow combine or clarify the connections between Indian religion and the Egyptian one. So it was always an ideal there as well, and her books kind of seem to oscillate between material from Egyptian temples and material in Indian temples, and the supposed connection between the two. So they were always looking for that. And in fact, the book Isis Unveiled as well, that kind of tells you what they were trying to do. The Isis Unveiled has an awful lot about India in it. So it was certainly a quest, an ideal, but probably at the time didn't completely deliver. And I kind of think, well, since then, right, I play my part in this as well. Surprisingly, I kind of think we can show a little bit more clearly some of the connections that if you look in the right place. And in order to do that is quite a arcane journey or whatever. So that's what happened. I was saying eventually I went back to college and I studied philosophy, was specialising in units, modules to do with India and Indian culture and all the rest, which is not the best career move in a way if you ever want a job as a kind of academic philosopher. It's a little bit too left field probably. You need to sort of stick to the straight and narrow. Anyway, these were the decisions I made, and I did my first degree, and I got interested in some of the technology, especially the medical systems, and I ended up doing another degree in which I initially studied Sanskrit in the same building, if you like, in the same tea room often as the people who studied Egyptology. We were all kind of mixed up together in the same institute, and they're still pretty close together in some ways. So it was, so though I started studying Sanskrit and Hindu culture and Hindu technology and Ayurvedic philosophy, which there is such a thing, eventually for one reason or another I kind of extended into changed departments in effect, and also then added some knowledge of Egyptology to the kind of to my armory of ideas and knowledge, which actually I discovered is not such an unusual thing. One of the most famous scholars buried quite not too far from where I'm living now is Max Muller. And Max Muller, who was a great Victorian scholar, was actually who translated the Vedas, so he was an expert on Sanskrit. Hence he got this name Moksha Muller, because he liberated a lot of people by translating the Vedas. Was also an expert on Egyptian culture and published a number of books on Egyptian history. So the combination of the two is not so unusual, although given the way things go, people might be a little bit suspicious and think that you can't really prove these connections, but it's there, the kind of flow between the two. So that's how I got into the Egyptian stuff, and so I always have a kind of a sort of foot in both camps, if you like, right from the beginning, which is quite useful. I should say in terms of, that's the academic side. In terms of my kind of personal life, I was always very, very interested in Hinduism and all the rest, and sort of studying magic. I would say if you study Crowley has this combination and fascination with these Indian magical ideas, I would say, as in the Kundalini yoga and even just the practice of yoga for Crowley. So studying Crowley and also, so you get an idea that you'd kind of like to cross over from Crowley into the Indian side. And at some point in my sort of journey, I also made contact with a Hindu group. I mean, as I say, this is the way Western esotericism is. It's kind of mixed up. That's another story. It's quite an interesting story about how an Indian guru contacted a load of kind of Crowley people in the UK and formed an organisation known as a Mukos, which I kind of eventually was able to make contact with and get some sort of initiation from. So these are the sort of range of interests that I've got, or biases if you like, but I think it works out okay. I should say as well that some of these ideas are difficult to, are not always that well known, because there's a certain amount of, I've always found that all the way along there was a certain amount of resistance, or it was difficult to, if you come up with some of these new ideas, to get people to even give you a proper hearing for them. As you probably know, I've obviously been involved in publishing and making books. One of the reasons, like a lot of people, I suppose, that I've got into that kind of thing in the first place was, well, you could always put it when nobody else was going to really do the material that I was writing, we weren't going to publish it or whatever. Actually, it was a friend of mine, her work on folklore and her drawings at the time, it was the same thing. Nobody was ever going to kind of give it any space. They weren't going to exhibit it, and so one thing or leads to another. You think the only way you're really going to get your message out there, even now, is if you do it yourself. Hence the podcast is one aspect of that. Publishing of books is another. How to get the message across, and I think there is a message. I think there is genuinely new, interesting material about religion, philosophy, culture, magic, that I've been privileged to become party to and to help promulgate and bring to the agenda, but through books and through talks. So going to this topic then, I thought I would start by saying, it's not exactly an accident. I did this book, ISIS in, originally it was called ISIS in India, right, to make it simple, but then politically, the rise of this kind of extremist group called ISIS made, strangely enough, made using the term ISIS, the name of the goddess Isis, difficult and easily misunderstood. I mean, I kid you not. I mean, there used to be a school in Oxford called the ISIS School, and they actually had to change their name about 10 years ago. Whether for that reason, I think it probably was because it got a bad vibe, which is a shame because obviously Isis is the name of the great goddess of antiquity, who is still worshipped by many millions of people around the world. So originally the book was called ISIS in India, or it started off as a kind of essay, really, as an idea that I'd learnt about from academics here, in fact. So I changed it to make it clearer, but it's still a bit of a mouthful, to Goddess of Egypt and India. That's this rather great cover, I think I should say. I'm not sure if that's going to come out the right way around, but you can see the picture, which is this sort of combination of Indian imagery with the Egyptian imagery. See, it's a rather lucky thing. That wasn't, see, as I speak, one of the great another piece of controversy is this thing about artificial intelligence, which is kind of combining things together. People say it's putting people out of work, but I think as well that a lot of people are finding it quite a useful technique to, especially magicians who are often combining things that don't normally get combined together. That the image on the ISIS book is not actually artificial intelligence, but it's almost next thing to it in a way, which is the thing they used to talk about, Photoshop. The use of Photoshop, there was a similar shock horror about Photoshop, how people were using it to create all these images that really didn't ought to exist, or were a little bit misleading, and they should have used the traditional methods of doing these things rather than this amazing piece of software that could create, put into the hands of people who weren't supposed to have access to this technology, the ability to create images such as this, which combined a sort of Indian sensibility with an Egyptian one in a seamless way, semi-automated. So that's how we came by the cover. As you can see, it's a fairly substantial book now. Originally it started out as an essay, and it is quite a substantial story, it as it turned out, which, as I say, I'm going to have to do in parts, but it involves all sorts of different areas. You've got the Indian whole history of what happens to the cult of Isis, assuming that there is one that whose history we can trace within India, which I should say there is. So there's a whole Indian connection, which is huge and full of literature and full of all sorts of amazing aspects to it. And then there's the Egyptian aspect, this cult of Isis, which again is even just from an Egyptian point of view, is a remarkable story of transformation and magic and a long development. And then how could this possibly be transferred? Well, it was. The cult of Isis was transferred all over the world. It was the first global religious goddess in lots of ways that is worshipped as far north as certainly Hadrian's Wall and all the rest, and as far east as even Japan and all over the place. This is well known, but quite how deep that cult was is one of the things that we're exploring. But in order to explore it, first of all, I had to kind of tease out certain aspects of the cult, tell the story of the cult in Egypt itself, which is a great story. Probably the first thing that I would do. And when we rather, myself and Diti, go to Egypt eventually, one of the things we're going to do is visit certain sites that are connected, not directly with, that contain things that were transferred, that are part of the signposts of the journey from Egypt to India, and of course from India back to Egypt. This is a bizarre thing. So many ideas that were transferred there find their way back to the Middle East and Near East, to Egypt, and that's how we learn of them as well. So many of the ideas we kind of treasure and we like have actually gone on this strange journey of their own. So part of the project is to retrace that. So in the first part, I'm probably just going to really focus on the bare facts of the transfer of the cult, and sort of concentrate on how it is in the Egyptian side, some of the Egyptian mysteries that we need to look at, some of the signposts, some of the kind of clues that we need to know about, so that we can recognize them when we actually transfer and start our research in the Indian tradition. This is where this is the thing that Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, founded in whenever it was, 1875, long time ago, didn't really have that sort of connection, that aspect to work with, didn't know about what she was supposed to be looking for. And things of 100 years later, we've got, or more than 100 years later, we've got more kind of tools in which to make that. So that's how we started. So there's the book, as I say, which I should say has got lots of illustrations, and many of them in colour. Over half the book is even set within Egypt itself. So why, I've got from an earlier lecture, the opening questions were why do we want to talk about this in the first place, which may seem obvious. I think it is just such a fascinating story. Assuming once you get over your maybe initial skepticism that such a story exists, which is fairly straightforward, once you know that this is, then you realise, God, this is going to be quite a journey and quite a fascinating story, and it's going to have surprising resonances with what we do now, and with all the things I do. As I say, usually people think I'm too academic, right? This is the thing. You're damned as you do, damned as you don't. People say, they say you're too academic. I was pitching an idea to talk to some society or other, and they said, I pitched this stuff, and they said, it was, most of their stuff, they did better if it had a more academic feel to it. And I thought, heart sunk in a way, because usually I get accused of being too academic, and I make a big effort to sort of bring out from this material the stuff that is relevant now. That's relevant if you're practicing magic or mysticism, or you're making your own religion, which is a thing that people do now. They make their own way. Which of this material from the ancient past can you actually use? Can it teach you anything? Are there techniques that you really ought to know about? Are there aspects of it that you're already using, but have been mislabeled? You didn't really know where, and that can be interesting to know where things really come from and why we do the things that we do. So it's an interesting story in its own right. I think as well that it's usually said that one of the big adventures of anything of thought is the journey of what they call Western consciousness to the East and to India. That journey that we've kind of been on over the last period of time, certainly over the last few hundred years, the rediscovery of the East, other than as the kind of not the myths, but the actual, the ideas, the deep ideas of the East. That's been a fascinating journey. That's a big adventure in a way, to break outside of for people in the West especially, to break outside of our kind of presuppositions and learn that there's something else. There's another source of ideas that we would really benefit from knowing. I should say that we're studying Indian philosophy here with a very eminent professor. One of the things that we both kind of thought was very strange, that another professor, of a great professor famous from another university, actually kind of discounted the entire East as being, he said there's no rational thought east of Suez. There's no rational thought, there's no philosophy, there's nothing, as far as he was concerned. There's nothing worth looking at. There was nothing worth looking at apart from pretty pictures from the East, which is a remarkable thing to write in an encyclopedia that's going to be read by people, young people, or people first starting out and learning about these things, that they're going to be told don't bother about these ideas. And that was, up until about 30 years ago, I think that was probably the common view, that there wasn't anything worth knowing from that part of the world. And that was, well, there's all sorts of terminology for what you might call, it was certainly wrong. Part of the quest or mission of my professor was to correct that idea, and he was very into very technical type of philosophy and logic, and to show how much of that was informed by Eastern thought, and how much of it was still useful. It was still a useful way of looking at the world. I think as well. So knowing something about India is I originally thought that's important. I think it is important. It's a gap in our knowledge. It was a gap in our not to have informed material from that part of the world. And this story of this journey, right, from the West to the East, is one way of kind of bringing that to life. And showing the affinity between the Egyptian ideas, which are so kind of unique within the Near East as well. They're quite different to all the other cultures on so many different areas. So you've got the idea that one culture provides the key to another, and the more I've studied this, I found not just that, but which was my original idea, but there are these remarkable parallels between the two different systems, which of course you say, well, I started out wanting to find out, but I think I can prove that. Certainly, it's even on the level something all the time. New insights come as we study this, but the idea that the temple within Egypt was a kind of living entity and was envisaged as a naked god or goddess lying flat on their back on the floor in the temple as a giant figure. That's the conception of the Egyptian temple. And so when you enter a temple in the ancient world, you were kind of entering into the body of the god and goddess. And this did have certainly aspects of reproductive imagery and sexual imagery as well, and sexual magic, which is again another big secret within the Egyptian tradition. But of course this is a very important aspect of the Indian tradition as well, as especially the tantric tradition, or one that early researchers found quite repulsive. It's funny when you look at all the Victorian people, they're sort of scholars. They're great scholars. They're fascinated by the material both in India and in Egypt. But they're also quite repulsed by some of the things that they find. In India, it was the erotic sculpture that they found very, very disturbing to see things at there. And I think you'll find the same in Egypt. Some of the text, when they were first translated, people they found it too disturbing, too repulsive in a way. The blatant sexuality in it, they kind of didn't quite know how to place it. They weren't coming from this quite puritanical Roman Greek background. It's not what they were used to, and it's taken a while to get rid of that idea. And to see actually that body magic aspect to it, the body magic, the sexuality is actually one of the very interesting aspects of the Indian culture, and I'd say it's also one of the very interesting aspects of the Egyptian one as well, although much more suppressed and submerged. So that there's an immediate parallel. Okay, so to sort of lay down a few facts then, so-called facts, to show some of the context in which we can sort of explore this idea. Here's the thesis then, if you like. At the time of Christ, so 2,000 years ago, let's say, there was a Roman or Greco-Roman merchant colony thriving in the south of India. So if you look at a map, get a map out, I'll put a map on the recording. In the south, there's a Roman colony, if you like. Now, people might think, oh, well, they've heard about things like the Silk Route and everything like that. This is a different thing. There may well be the Silk Route, but there's this other, if you like, spice route. Maybe they call it the spice route. This other kind of route, and it's not a route in the sense of overland. It's obviously a route. People must have got to the south of India, given when you look at the map and the geography, they must have got there by over the sea. This colony in the south of India is actually the first point of landing that you get if you make quite an epic sea journey across what is now the Arabian Ocean, or the Indian Ocean as well. So there's a story in itself. You kind of look at the map and you kind of think, oh well, but this was one of the great adventures. People talk about circumnavigating the earth and all this sort of stuff, but before people did that sort of stuff, there were all these other kind of steps that had to be put into place, these sort of slightly shorter but still quite extended nautical journeys across great oceans, whether that's from India to the southern tip of Africa, that's one of them, or from India to the Gulf, basically, the Arabian Gulf, the Red Sea. So there we go. We've got this Roman colony. I should point out that the Roman Empire, great as it was, never did include India. They never quite got that far. There were limits to Roman power. So even though they never kind of conquered India and made it part of its empire, one of the great discoveries that came at the end of the Second World War by Mortimer Wheeler, the famous archaeologist who we got out of the army. He stayed in India and he took over their early Department of Archaeology after independence. And he said one of the great discoveries in the collections there was the presence of the Romans in the south of India. And you can read his account of how he kind of visiting all these warehouses and collections full of ancient stuff from ancient archaeological sites, and reaching behind cupboards and saying, "Oh, look, there's a Greek amphora, or there's a whole bunch of Roman coins and everything," and making maps and say, "Well, scattered all over the place. All these Roman coins. Why are they there?" And coming to the conclusion that the Romans were there in the south of India as a trading expedition, and their main colony, stronghold, if you like, was at first landfall at Cochin, in what is now coast Kerala, and they built a whole colony there in order to facilitate the trading, because there were lots of things that people in the Roman world and in Europe wanted from India, primarily so many of the spices, the pepper and the special medicinal pepper, the dyes and precious stones and all that kind of stuff that came from India, that people, the healing herbs, a lot of special medical herbs come from that part of the world. Even today it's famous for it. So they set up a colony, having mastered this journey, which I should say takes 40 days and nights across the ocean, which, if you think of that, the technology of the Roman era, and it didn't start then apparently either, it began earlier than that. That's quite an adventure and a story, and it's just on a nautical level in terms of shipping and navigation. But eventually they worked it out, and they had this colony. We're going to tell the story of that at some point. Whenever they built a colony, the Romans, they would always build, and the people with them would always build some sort of religious institution. Primarily, there'd have to be a Roman temple for the dedicated to the spirit of the emperor of the time. So there would certainly, at the very least, be that. And they have Greek navigators running their ships and all the rest, so they kind of probably have their religious needs, which, again, not to get too far ahead of it, but the main god or deity of the Greek navigators themselves would have been Isis, who was particularly at that time associated with navigation and the sea. So there's a kind of obvious reason why they might be connected. So you would expect, on ancient maps, incidentally, of which exist from the Roman world, this colony is shown on the map. And I'll give some examples of that, for some shots of that map. And it also shows the presence of a Romanesque type temple in South India. None of that completely exists there, but there are kind of memories of it, if you like. The other side of so this place where this shrine, it became very, very famous in the classical world. We've forgotten it. The lost city of Musiris. And it is lost because at some point there was a great storm and the whole thing, earthquake or whatever, disappeared mostly beneath the ocean. But it's somewhere in the vicinity of ancient Cochin, and there are kind of archaeological sites trying to locate it, but they're never going to find the actual thing, but they find things connected with it. So there are temples in the vicinity, of course, from the Hindu things, and these are themselves, if we switch now to Indian history, these are very, very significant in terms of Indian religious history as well, which we need to go in. They're not just any old temple. They play a part in the whole religious reform of South India, the rise of Hinduism itself, or the reform that becomes modern Hinduism, is located in this same place. So not surprisingly, there are kind of these temples which, when you see pictures of them, have a kind of Roman look to them, actually, strangely enough. Very distinctive Kerala style of temple building. And one temple, this is one of the facts that we're going to explore. One of the temples that does exist there that's still in use, an enormous temple, has something very odd about it in terms of its subterranean structure, something underneath it. And again, if you was following some of the other streams of thought and the magic that we teach, you'll in the House of Life here, you'll kind of know that this idea of subterranean mysteries of crypts and buried things is again an incredibly important aspect of magic, and it's not just academic because it's part of the image that we use, we bring to mind when we do certain types of magical activities. So again, there's a historical interest, but there's also a practical interest. This is joining the dots. This is actually telling you how the magic of both traditions is done. So this idea of an underground mystery, a subterranean buried ideal, it's also so that it's strange that this very, very significant temple in India also has a subterranean mystery. It has a thing called the hidden chamber, which is written about by experts in India itself, that doesn't quite fit with Indian and Hindu kind of mythology and religious building and all the rest. It's very odd structure. It's difficult to explain why it might exist, and the more we go into and explore these structures, the greater the mystery comes, or perhaps the greater the demystification comes when we realize what these things are, right? Because we can use certain clues from the Egyptian tradition to sort of throw light on both areas have a fascinating connection. But these are the bare facts. There really was a Roman colony in the south of India. There really was a journey from the Red Sea to a regular journey, a regular trade from the Red Sea, which is part of the Egyptian coast, to the extreme south of India. This trade was taking place and is well documented, well known, and was quite a major feat of discovery. There is this temple that eventually did fall into the hands of certain types of reforming Hindus, and have changed the worship in the temple over the years from what it originally might have been to something more recognizably Hindu, but nevertheless a little bit, or even the reform that they made preserves a certain unorthodox nature to it, the getting rid of the original rituals and the substitution of Kali worship, which is a way of overlaying something that was there before. Even the descendants of the original possible worshippers of Isis, or somehow connected with Isis, are still even now connected with the temple, but distant way, maybe in terms of some sort of nominal ownership, but they're kind of disenfranchised, and they have their own way of, they don't worship in the temple, they have their own things that they do, which when you look into them are kind of strangely reminiscent of the cult of Isis. It's funny, you can, again, going back, there's enough to take in, is this idea of the Isis unveiled in Blavatsky. The name of the book is Isis Unveiled, and you say, well, actually, in terms of Egyptian culture, most of the time Isis didn't have a veil. She didn't have a veil. But then at the time we're talking about, towards the end of it, she ended up with a veil. There's a sort of strange reason why she ends up with being thought to have had a veil, when originally she didn't actually have a veil. It was just kind of assumed that she would have. And there's a strange counterpoint to that in the Indian tradition, is that one of the goddesses associated with this strange subterranean temple in India itself is one of the few Hindu goddesses that actually has a veil. So the veil is not not that common at the time in India either, but for somehow there's a whole mythology about the veil. So the irony of that, if you like, of Blavatsky's book Isis Unveiled, was you can read an abridgment of it, I think, but I think you don't really need to. But it is ironic, the title Isis Unveiled, and that how this theme of the veil, which is a very interesting thing, kind of plays out first in Egypt and then in India, one way or another. Fascinating story. So far I've stuck with not really with interpretation. Most of this is verifiable fact. You can find academics and all sorts of things. You probably even find on Wikipedia. But that's the basic story of ISIS in India, and the outline and the thing that I'm going to explore over a number of episodes in between a trip out to Egypt, where I'm going to explore hopefully a particular monument there, which I'll tell you about next time, which also teaches an awful lot about how to practice the Egyptian religion, and we're already using many of the insights from it, but there are also lots of insights that people haven't quite absorbed, and maybe I'll be lucky enough to kind of introduce you to some of those things that will help to make, if you're interested in the magical religion, how to bring it alive. But even on the level of just a story, a remarkable story of the transference of and the travelling of the cult of ISIS across the world, I think what's to come is going to be great. I say next time I shall hopefully talk about the nautical adventure itself, which has a lot of magic in it that we're going to explore. But perhaps in between, if I get the right footage, I'll just talk about. It will take long enough if we find this particular place. If we manage to film there, even that is going to be mind-blowing. To be honest, it really is. The stuff that we're going to learn there, and the insights we're going to get into the real heart and secret of magic, which, as I hinted at, is we could say, inverted commas, also tantric. It's also to do with the magic of the body, and ideas that later become changed and transformed into a tradition in the medieval world called alchemy, which is a kind of poor reflection, really, or pale reflection of what was actually being practiced in Egypt, if you know where to look and you know what to do. Anyway, so lots of things to look forward to in the new sequence and season of the Egyptian Magick podcast. If you want to get a little bit ahead of it, do please check out the book Isis in India, which I say started as an afterthought, as a side thought, and it became quite a big thing, really, and it's a mystery that is still developing. Okay, well, so thanks for listening. Do listen to the other things and send in any questions and feedback and images you may have. And enjoy the pictures, and stay well, and see you next time. Senebti, which is meaning health to you and well-being in the Egyptian manner. Take care.